What if I told you that the collective unconscious, that vast ocean of inherited psychological patterns that shapes every decision you make, is actually a programmable system that you can consciously access and manipulate? What if everything you've been taught about being at the mercy of unconscious forces, about dreams and symbols being mysterious and uncontrollable, about archetypal patterns determining your fate, is completely backwards? What if the most powerful psychological force in human existence isn't some mystical, untouchable realm, but rather a sophisticated network that responds to specific inputs and can be deliberately influenced through precise techniques? The collective unconscious isn't just observable, it's hackable. And the moment you understand how to access its operating system, you'll realize that every limitation you've accepted about human potential has been nothing more than a failure to understand the interface. Most people spend their entire lives as passive recipients of archetypal programming, never realizing they can become active programmers themselves. Most people don't realize they're living as unconscious slaves to psychological patterns that were never meant to control them. They wake up each morning responding to the same emotional triggers, making the same types of decisions, attracting the same kinds of relationships and opportunities, all while believing they're exercising free will. What they don't understand is that they're operating from a set of inherited psychological programs, what I call archetypal patterns, that run automatically in the background of consciousness. These aren't just personal habits or learned behaviors, they're ancient software installed in the human psyche over millennia of evolution. The first problem is that most people are completely unaware of these unconscious programs running their lives. They experience anxiety, depression, relationship conflicts, and career stagnation without recognizing that these symptoms are often manifestations of archetypal patterns playing out unconsciously. The shadow archetype creates self-sabotage and projection. The anima and animus create relationship dysfunction and gender confusion. The mother archetype creates codependency or abandonment patterns. The hero archetype creates either grandiosity or learned helplessness. These patterns operate like malware in the psyche, creating predictable behavioral loops that most people mistake for personality traits or character flaws. The second problem is that these unconscious patterns compound and reinforce each other, creating what I call archetypal complexes, self-perpetuating psychological systems that become stronger with each repetition. When someone constantly attracts unavailable romantic partners, they're not just unlucky in love, they're running an unconscious program that seeks familiar psychological patterns, even when those patterns cause suffering. When someone sabotages every opportunity for success just as they're about to achieve their goals, they're not lacking willpower, they're executing unconscious code written by ancestral trauma and collective fears around power and visibility. These patterns create psychological prisons that most people don't even realize they're trapped in. The third problem is that conventional psychology treats these symptoms rather than addressing the underlying archetypal programming. Traditional therapy focuses on conscious thoughts and behaviors, but it rarely accesses the deeper operating system where these patterns originate. People spend years in analysis talking about their childhoods and relationship patterns without ever learning how to identify and reprogram the unconscious archetypal forces that create those patterns in the first place. They're trying to change their lives by adjusting the user interface, while the deeper programming remains completely untouched. The fourth problem is that most people have no idea how to distinguish between their authentic self and the archetypal programs they're running. They think their personality is who they are, when in reality, much of what they consider personality is just a collection of inherited psychological patterns. They confuse archetypal possession, being overtaken by unconscious forces, with genuine self-expression. This creates a fundamental identity confusion where people spend their entire lives trying to improve or change aspects of themselves that aren't even authentically theirs to begin with. The hidden cost of this unconscious programming is staggering. People waste decades of their lives repeating the same patterns, making the same mistakes, and experiencing the same limitations, never realizing that they have the power to access and reprogram the very source code of their psychological experience. They settle for incremental improvements in their external circumstances, while the deeper patterns that create those circumstances remain completely unchanged. They live as psychological peasants in a realm where they could be operating as conscious architects of their own psyche. Why do conventional approaches continue to fail? Because they're trying to solve archetypal problems with personal solutions. They're attempting to fix collective unconscious programming with individual conscious effort. It's like trying to change your computer's behavior by talking to the screen instead of accessing the operating system. The collective unconscious operates according to specific laws and responds to particular types of intervention, but most people, including most therapists, have never learned how to interface with it directly. But here's what I've discovered through decades of research into the deepest layers of the human psyche. The collective unconscious isn't some mystical, untouchable realm. It's a sophisticated psychological operating system that responds to specific inputs and can be consciously programmed through proven techniques. I'm going to share with you 5 precise methods for accessing and influencing your archetypal programming, methods that can literally reprogram your unconscious patterns and free you from psychological limitations you never knew you had the power to change. The scientific foundation for what I'm about to share comes from decades of empirical observation and systematic analysis of thousands of cases. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what I discovered through psychological research. The brain operates through pattern recognition and neural pathway formation that directly corresponds to what I call archetypal programming. When we understand how to access these deeper patterns, we can literally rewire our unconscious responses and create new psychological programming that serves our conscious intentions rather than sabotaging them. This isn't about positive thinking or surface level behavioral modification. This is about accessing the source code of human psychology and becoming a conscious programmer of your own psyche. The people who understand these principles operate from a completely different level of psychological freedom and personal power. They don't just cope with their psychological patterns, they consciously design them. They don't just manage their emotions, they architect their emotional landscape. They don't just react to archetypal forces, they harness those forces to create the life they consciously choose. What I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of consciousness, free will, and personal transformation. You'll never look at your thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns the same way again. You'll begin to see the invisible psychological forces that have been shaping your reality, and more importantly, you'll learn exactly how to take conscious control of those forces and redirect them toward outcomes you actually want to create. The first foundational concept you must understand is that what most people call consciousness is actually just the surface layer of a much deeper psychological operating system. Think of your conscious mind as the user interface on a computer. It's what you see and interact with directly, but it's not where the real programming happens. The collective unconscious is like the operating system running in the background, executing programs and making decisions that shape your experience without your conscious awareness. But here's what most people miss: just as you can learn to access and modify a computer's operating system, you can learn to access and influence the programming of the collective unconscious. The key is understanding that consciousness itself is not a thing, but a process, a dynamic interface between your individual psyche and a larger field of archetypal patterns that exist in what I call the psychoid realm. Consider this analogy. Imagine your psyche as a radio receiver. Most people think they're stuck with whatever station happens to be playing, whatever archetypal patterns they happen to be unconsciously tuned into. But consciousness is actually the tuning mechanism. When you understand how to operate this mechanism consciously, you can literally change the frequency you're receiving and access entirely different sets of archetypal programming. Or think of it like this. The collective unconscious is like a vast library containing every psychological pattern that has ever existed in human experience. Most people wander through this library unconsciously, randomly picking up books and having those stories play out in their lives without any awareness of what's happening. But when you understand how the library is organized and how to navigate it consciously, you can deliberately choose which archetypal stories you want to activate in your experience. Here's a third way to understand this. The relationship between conscious and unconscious is like the relationship between a programmer and a computer. Most people think they are the computer, passive recipients of whatever programming happens to be running. But the truth is you are the programmer. You have the capacity to write new code, debug existing programs, and completely redesign the software that runs your psychological experience. The neuroscience behind this is remarkable. Modern brain imaging shows that what we call archetypal activation corresponds to specific neural network patterns that can be triggered and modified through conscious intervention. When someone experiences what I call archetypal possession, being overtaken by the mother complex or the hero complex or the shadow, their brain shows predictable patterns of activation that are remarkably consistent across individuals and cultures. This suggests that archetypal patterns are not just metaphors but actual psychological structures with measurable neurological correlates. But here's the revolutionary part: these same neural patterns can be consciously triggered and modified through specific techniques. When you learn to recognize archetypal activation in real time and apply the correct interventions, you can literally interrupt unconscious programming and install new patterns that serve your conscious intentions. The reverse examples prove this point powerfully. When people remain unconsciously identified with limiting archetypal patterns, their lives become predictably constrained. Someone possessed by the victim archetype will unconsciously create situations that confirm their powerlessness. Someone identified with the martyr archetype will repeatedly sacrifice themselves in ways that create resentment and exhaustion. Someone overtaken by the perfectionist archetype will sabotage their own success through impossible standards and paralysis. Think about the time when you felt completely unlike yourself, when you reacted to a situation in a way that surprised you either positively or negatively. What you experienced in that moment was likely archetypal activation. Either you accessed a more empowered archetypal pattern than you normally operate from, or you were temporarily possessed by a more limiting pattern. The fact that you could feel the difference proves that these patterns are not fixed aspects of your personality, but rather psychological programs that can be activated and deactivated. The second crucial concept is the fundamental shift from unconscious archetypal possession to conscious archetypal collaboration. Most people think the goal is to eliminate archetypal influences and operate purely from rational consciousness, but this is both impossible and undesirable. Archetypal forces are not obstacles to be overcome, they are sources of psychological power to be harnessed. The conventional understanding treats archetypal patterns as either positive or negative, as if the hero archetype is good and the shadow archetype is bad. But this binary thinking completely misses the point. Every archetypal pattern contains both destructive and creative potential. The shadow, when unconscious, creates self-sabotage and projection. But when consciously integrated, the shadow becomes a source of authentic power, creative energy, and psychological depth. The psychological mechanism behind this shift is what I call archetypal differentiation. Instead of being unconsciously identified with archetypal patterns, thinking that you are the pattern, you learn to recognize when specific archetypes are active and choose how to work with their energy consciously. This is like the difference between being possessed by an emotion and choosing to use that emotional energy for a specific purpose. Here's how this mechanism works in the brain. Unconscious archetypal possession involves automatic neural pathway activation that bypasses conscious evaluation. The pattern runs automatically, like a program executing without user input. But conscious archetypal collaboration involves what neuroscientists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own mental processes in real time and make conscious choices about how to direct that energy. The most common mental blocks that prevent this shift are identification and resistance. Identification means thinking you are the archetypal pattern rather than recognizing that you're temporarily expressing it. Someone might say, I'm just not a confident person, instead of recognizing I'm currently operating from the victim archetype and can choose to activate the hero archetype instead. Resistance means fighting against archetypal patterns instead of learning to work with them consciously. Someone might try to suppress their anger, shadow energy, instead of learning to channel that same energy into appropriate assertiveness and boundary setting. The breakthrough happens when you realize that you are not any particular archetypal pattern, but rather the consciousness that can choose which patterns to activate and how to express them. You become what I call the archetypal conductor, the conscious awareness that can orchestrate different archetypal energies like instruments in a symphony. The specific mental shift involves moving from I am statements to I choose to express statements. Instead of I am angry, you learn to say I choose to express the assertive aspect of my shadow energy. Instead of I am depressed, you learn to say I choose to activate the wise aspect of the sage archetypal to understand what this experience is teaching me. The third essential technique is what I call active imagination programming, a systematic method for consciously communicating with and reprogramming unconscious archetypal patterns. Elite performers throughout history have intuitively used variations of this technique, though they often didn't understand the psychological mechanisms involved. Military leaders like Alexander the Great and Napoleon consciously cultivated specific archetypal identities: the warrior, the king, the conqueror, through systematic mental training and ritualistic practices. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo used what they called divine inspiration, but what was actually conscious communication with archetypal creative forces. Modern high performers in business and athletics use visualization and mental rehearsal techniques that are essentially sophisticated forms of archetypal programming. The brain science behind active imagination programming is fascinating. When you engage in conscious dialogue with archetypal patterns through structured imagery and symbolic communication, you're literally creating new neural pathways that bridge conscious and unconscious processes. fMRI studies show that imagined experience creates similar neural activation patterns to actual experiences, which means that conscious archetypal work literally rewires your unconscious programming. Here's the step-by-step implementation process. First, identify the specific archetypal pattern you want to work with. This might be a limiting pattern you want to transform, or an empowering pattern you want to strengthen. Second, enter a relaxed, meditative state where you can access unconscious content more easily. Third, create a symbolic representation of the archetypal pattern. Visualize it as a character, an animal, a landscape, or any symbolic form that feels authentic to your psyche. Fourth, engage in conscious dialogue with this archetypal image. Ask it questions. What do you need from me? What are you trying to protect or achieve? How can we work together more consciously? What would you look like if you were expressing your highest potential? Fifth, negotiate new agreements with the archetypal pattern. Instead of letting it run automatically, establish conscious parameters for how and when it will be expressed. Sixth, create symbolic rituals or practices that reinforce the new programming. This might involve specific visualizations, physical movements, verbal affirmations, or creative expressions that anchor the new archetypal relationship in your unconscious. Seventh, practice the new pattern in progressively challenging real-world situations until it becomes your default programming. The most common mistakes people make with this technique include treating it as mere fantasy instead of genuine psychological work, trying to eliminate archetypal patterns instead of transforming them, rushing the process instead of allowing unconscious patterns to reveal themselves gradually, and failing to integrate the work with practical behavioral changes. The key to success is understanding that archetypal communication requires a specific type of consciousness, what I call symbolic thinking. You're not trying to have rational conversations with unconscious patterns. You're learning to communicate in the language of the unconscious, which is the language of symbol, metaphor, and image. Start practicing this technique immediately with a simple exercise. Identify one limiting behavioral pattern in your life. Create a symbolic representation of the psychological force behind that pattern and spend 10 minutes in conscious dialogue with that symbol. Ask it what it's trying to accomplish and how you can work together more consciously. Don't analyze or judge what emerges. Simply observe and engage with whatever symbolic content arises. The fourth essential method is what I call archetypal constellation mapping, a systematic process for understanding and reorganizing the entire network of psychological patterns that shape your experience. Most people think of personal growth as changing individual behaviors or thoughts, but archetypal patterns exist in relationship to each other as part of larger psychological systems. Think of your psyche as containing multiple archetypal characters, each with their own motivations, fears, and agendas. The perfectionist wants everything to be flawless. The rebel wants to break rules and assert independence. The caretaker wants to help others and avoid conflict. The achiever wants recognition and success. Most people experience these different aspects as internal conflicts or contradictions, but they're actually parts of a larger psychological ecosystem that can be consciously organized and harmonized. The technical mechanism behind archetypal constellation work involves what cognitive scientists call parts integration, the process of creating conscious communication and cooperation between different aspects of the psyche. When archetypal patterns are unconscious and disconnected, they often work at cross purposes, creating internal sabotage and conflicting motivations. But when they're brought into conscious relationship with each other, they can function as a coordinated psychological team. Here's the step-by-step process for mapping your archetypal constellation. First, identify the primary archetypal patterns that are active in your psyche. You can do this by looking at recurring themes in your relationships, career patterns, emotional triggers, and life challenges. Each repeated pattern likely corresponds to a specific archetypal force. Second, create symbolic representations for each archetypal pattern. You might visualize them as characters in a story, animals in an ecosystem, or figures around a council table. Third, map the relationships between these patterns. Which ones support each other? Which ones conflict? Which ones have never been in conscious communication? Fourth, facilitate conscious dialogue between conflicting archetypal patterns. If your achiever and your perfectionist are constantly sabotaging each other, bring them into conversation. Let the achiever express its desire for progress and recognition. Let the perfectionist express its fear of criticism and failure. Then help them negotiate agreements about how they can support rather than undermine each other. Fifth, identify missing archetypal patterns that could bring balance to your constellation. If you have strong caretaker and achiever patterns, but no warrior energy, you might struggle with boundaries and assertiveness. Consciously cultivating the warrior archetype could provide the missing psychological function. Before this work, people often experience what I call archetypal chaos, different patterns activating randomly and working at cross purposes. They might be nurturing and caring in one situation, ruthlessly competitive in another, and completely passive in a third, with no conscious understanding of what's driving these different responses. This creates a sense of internal fragmentation and unpredictability. After archetypal constellation work, people experience what I call archetypal coherence, different patterns working together as a coordinated psychological team. They understand which archetypal energies are most useful in different situations and can consciously choose how to respond from their full range of psychological resources. The most common sabotage patterns that interfere with this work include archetypal favoritism. preferring certain patterns while rejecting others, and archetypal perfectionism, trying to create ideal relationships between patterns instead of accepting their authentic dynamics. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate conflict between different aspects of yourself, but to make that conflict conscious and productive rather than unconscious and destructive. The fifth and most powerful technique is what I call symbolic action programming, the use of specific physical actions and rituals to directly influence unconscious archetypal patterns. While mental techniques work with the symbolic language of the unconscious, physical actions create immediate somatic changes that can rapidly shift psychological states and reinforce new programming. The power of physical action lies in what neuroscientists call embodied cognition, the recognition that psychological states are not just mental phenomena, but are intimately connected to physical postures, movements, and sensory experiences. When you change your physical state, you automatically change your psychological state. More importantly, when you consciously design physical actions that correspond to specific archetypal patterns, you can literally embody new psychological programming. Throughout history, every culture has developed ritualistic practices that were essentially sophisticated forms of archetypal programming. Ancient warriors used specific movement patterns, breathing techniques, and symbolic actions to activate the warrior archetype before battle. Shamanic traditions used dance, drumming, and ceremonial actions to facilitate communication with archetypal forces. Mystery schools used initiatory rituals and symbolic performances to program specific psychological transformations. Here are multiple implementation options for symbolic action programming. First, movement-based practices. Create specific physical movements that embody the archetypal patterns you want to strengthen. If you want to activate more warrior energy, practice movements that are strong, direct, and assertive. If you want to cultivate the sage archetype, practice movements that are slow, deliberate, and contemplative. Second, breathing practices. Different breathing patterns activate different nervous system states and corresponding archetypal energies. Rapid, powerful breathing activates warrior and hero patterns. Slow, deep breathing activates sage and heal patterns. Rhythmic, cyclical breathing activates creative and feminine patterns. Third, postural programming. The way you hold your body directly influences your psychological state. Practice embodying the physical posture of the archetypal pattern you want to strengthen. Stand like a warrior, sit like a sage, move like a creator. Your unconscious will automatically begin to align with whatever pattern you consistently embody physically. Fourth, symbolic object work. Choose physical objects that represent specific archetypal energies and incorporate them into daily practices. This might involve wearing specific colors, carrying symbolic items, or creating environmental arrangements that anchor particular archetypal states. Fifth, ceremonial practices. Design simple ceremonies that mark psychological transitions and reinforce new archetypal programming. This might involve lighting candles while setting intentions, creating artistic expressions that represent psychological changes, or performing symbolic actions that represent the release of old patterns and the activation of new ones. The historical validation for these practices is overwhelming. Every effective psychological transformation tradition has recognized that lasting change requires physical as well as mental intervention. The body holds psychological patterns just as much as the mind does, and those patterns must be addressed somatically to create genuine transformation. The reason physical action is more powerful than mental work alone is that it bypasses the conscious mind's tendency to intellectualize and resist change. When you physically embody a new archetypal pattern, your unconscious begins to accept that pattern as real and possible in a way that purely mental work often cannot achieve. For immediate engagement, choose one archetypal pattern you want to strengthen and create a simple daily physical practice that embodies that energy. This might be as simple as standing in a powerful posture for 2 minutes each morning while setting intentions for the day, or as complex as creating a full movement sequence that represents the psychological transformation you want to create. Practice this physical programming consistently for at least 21 days, which is the minimum time required for new neural pathways to begin stabilizing. Notice how the physical practice begins to influence your psychological state, your emotional responses, and your behavioral choices throughout the day. The implementation psychology behind all of these techniques requires understanding that you are not trying to fix a broken personality, but rather learning to operate as the conscious architect of your own psychological experience. This is fundamentally about identity transformation, shifting from seeing yourself as a victim of unconscious forces to recognizing yourself as the programmer of those forces. Most previous attempts at personal change have failed because they were based on the false assumption that you need to fight against or eliminate aspects of your psyche. But archetypal patterns cannot be destroyed, they can only be transformed. The goal is not to become a different person, but to become a more conscious person, someone who understands and can skillfully work with the full range of psychological forces available to human experience. When you begin to experience yourself as the conscious conductor of your archetypal constellation rather than the unconscious victim of random psychological forces, everything changes. You stop trying to control external circumstances and start architecting your internal responses. You stop reacting from unconscious patterns and start choosing from conscious awareness. You stop living as a psychological peasant and start operating as a psychological sovereign. The certainty I want you to understand is these techniques work because they're based on the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself. You already have access to every archetypal pattern that has ever existed in human experience. You already possess the capacity for psychological transformation that rivals anything achieved by the greatest individuals in history. The only difference between psychological limitation and psychological mastery is conscious access to and skillful work with the archetypal forces that shape human experience. When you implement these methods consistently, you will begin to experience what I call archetypal fluency, the ability to consciously access and express the full range of human psychological potential. You will no longer be limited by the narrow range of patterns you happen to inherit or learned unconsciously. You will become capable of psychological responses that are appropriate to each situation, rather than being trapped in repetitive patterns that may be completely inappropriate to your current circumstances. This work will challenge every assumption you have about the nature of personality, free will, and human potential. You will discover that what you thought were fixed limitations are actually just unconscious programming that can be accessed and modified. You will realize that the most powerful force in human existence is not external circumstances, but the conscious capacity to architect your own psychological responses to those circumstances. What we've explored today represents a complete revolution in understanding the nature of consciousness and personal transformation. We've moved beyond the illusion that you are a victim of unconscious forces and discovered that you are actually the conscious programmer of those forces. We've learned that the collective unconscious is not some mystical, untouchable realm, but rather a sophisticated operating system that responds to specific techniques and can be deliberately influenced through conscious intervention. You now understand that archetypal patterns are not fixed limitations, but programmable psychological resources that can be consciously accessed, modified, and directed toward outcomes you choose to create. You have specific, actionable methods for transforming unconscious psychological programming and becoming the conscious architect of your own psychological experience. The choice you face now is simple. You can continue operating as an unconscious recipient of random archetypal programming, or you can begin implementing these techniques and discover what becomes possible when you take conscious control of the deepest forces that shape human experience. You can remain psychologically reactive, or you can become psychologically creative. I want to hear about your experiences with these techniques in the comments below. Which archetypal patterns have you identified as most active in your life? What symbolic representations emerge when you begin conscious dialogue with these patterns? How does physical archetypal programming change your psychological state and behavioral responses? Your experiences contribute to our collective understanding of consciousness itself and help refine these techniques for maximum effectiveness. Remember, you are not trying to become someone different. You are learning to become who you actually are, beneath the layers of unconscious programming that have been running your life automatically. You are not fixing broken aspects of yourself. You are awakening to the full range of psychological potential that has always been available to you. You are not overcoming limitations. You are recognizing that most limitations exist only in unconscious programming that can be consciously accessed and transformed. The collective unconscious is hackable. Your archetypal programming is modifiable. Your psychological potential is unlimited. The only question is whether you will choose to remain unconscious of these possibilities, or begin the work of conscious psychological transformation that can revolutionize every aspect of your experience. The interface is available, the techniques are proven, the choice is yours.